Hello, and you're listening to Eco Justice Radio. We present environmental and climate stories from a social justice frame featuring voices not necessarily heard on mainstream media. Eco Justice Radio acknowledges that we recorded this show on the traditional territory of the Ahachiman people and all of their relatives in the place we call San Juan Capistrano. Welcome, I'm Jack Eidt. On today's show, Honduras in Resistance, a case study in U.S. imperialism and corruption. We feature a conversation with Grahame Russell, co-founder and director of Rights Action. Grahame Russell, based out of Canada, has worked on human rights and justice, humanitarian relief, land defense, and environmental issues in Central America since 1985. He is director of Rights Action, focusing particularly on Guatemala and Honduras. He's also a non-practicing lawyer and part-time professor at the University of Northern British Columbia. Rights Action supports land and environmental and human rights defense struggles in Central America, resisting harms caused by sectors of the unjust global economy, mining, hydroelectric dams, African palm, sugarcane, bananas, tourism, sweatshop factories, and economic warfare, also called sanctions, of the U.S., Canada, and other global North countries and actors. The United States has always been a speak softly and carry a big stick purveyor of imperial might, a term attributed to Theodore Roosevelt. Speaking softly meant the use of peaceful diplomacy, negotiations. The big stick is, of course, today's nuclear war machine. In Roosevelt's day, this required negotiations punctuated by intelligent forethought and just action. Today, we have manufactured intelligence and specifically unjust, hegemonic, and violent actions towards other countries without actual negotiations. We kidnap leaders, as in Venezuela, based on fake charges of drug trafficking. We speak loudly for a minute, don't wait for an answer, and then invade if they don't comply with whatever whim our fearless and heedless leaders demand. This is what we did in Iran. In this hemisphere, the speak loudly and wield a big nuclear stick is in full swing with Secretary of War's Greater North America push, not to be confused with Israel's Greater Israel push, really. Pete Hegseth, whose days are numbered as the military, is in active rebellion of his heedless war crimes. Stay tuned for that. He's also the man behind these unprovoked attacks, bombing civilians and their infrastructure, turning the U.S. into a cardboard bully villain in a losing effort to advance the faltering U.S. empire. Here he is on the Greater North America push.
That is why President Trump has drawn a new strategic map from Greenland to the Gulf of America to the Panama Canal and its surrounding countries. At the Department of War, we call this strategic map the Greater North America. Why? Because every sovereign nation and territory north of the equator, from Greenland to Ecuador and from Alaska to Guyana, is not part of the global South. It is a security perimeter in this great neighborhood that we all live in. Each one of these countries border either the North Atlantic or the North Pacific. Each one of these countries sits north of the two basic geographic barriers that exist in this region, the Amazon and the Andes Mountains. This is basic geography that we don't teach in schools as much as we should. And it restores our North-South relations, and we must get it right. In the North, the United States must enhance posture and presence in cooperation with you and our sovereign partners to defend our shared immediate security perimeter. In the South, meaning south of the equator, the other side of this great neighborhood, we will strengthen partnerships through increased burden sharing. This will enable you to take a greater role to defend the South Atlantic and the South Pacific, and to secure critical infrastructure and resources in partnership with us and other Western nations. This is what we did in World War II, just like we sunk ships with torpedoes in World War II. At the Department of War, we called it the quarter sphere defense. And we will do this again.
Greater America push. Here's a clip of the Garifuna Waranawa New Year's ceremony from the village of Cosuna on the north coast of Honduras. So welcome, Grahame Russell, to Eco Justice Radio.
Thank you for having me on, Jack.
Yes, you're co-founder and director of Rights Action, who, according to your website, funding and supporting human rights, justice, land, and environmental defense struggles in Guatemala and Honduras. So a lot is happening with the United States. Donald Trump and his cabal have big plans. There was the Shield of the Americas gathering, which they call a counter-cartel coalition. 17 different Latin American countries. Sounds like a lot, but it's definitely not the majority of Latin American countries in Central and South America and the Caribbean, focused on using their militaries to deal with whatever situation comes up. Boat strikes in the Caribbean and Pacific, invading Venezuela and kidnapping their leader, Nicolas Maduro, and his wife. They've been strangling economically Cuba, threatening Mexico and Colombia, bombings in Ecuador and on the Colombian border. And all the while, the United States and Israel are bombing Iran mercilessly. Now, just to catch people up, Trump also put his thumb on the election scale in Honduras as his favored right-wing candidate, Nasri Tito Asfura. Despite technical problems and allegations of fraud, became president of Honduras and joined in on the counter-cartel coalition. We'll talk about more about this election and its ramifications in a bit. But first, can you tell us from your perspective what the cultivation of U.S. military force, lethal, violent force, means for hemispheric affairs?
I'll throw something out just off the top. I don't think any of these new alliances, the Shield of the Americas, etc., really have anything to do with drugs. And I'll just throw that out. There's probably a bit of grayness in that discussion, but it's as a generalization. This is just a sort of a specific alliance of leaders and elites in certain countries beholden to this version of the United States. And this version of the United States is sort of, in many ways, historic U.S. imperialism across the Americas, and it's on steroids. So it's an extreme version, but there's nothing new with what the U.S. is doing. It's just doing it at an extreme level, and it has serious ramifications inside the United States as well. But it has really nothing to do with drugs as a generalization. I'd be glad to discuss that further. And actually, Honduras is a horrifically brutal case study to prove my point. So the ramifications are awful because it's sort of U.S. imperialism in the Americas, call it the Monroe Doctrine, the Dunroe Doctrine, or whatever. It's just this rich, powerful country. And Canada, for all the wrong reasons, is either supporting the U.S. on this. I am Canadian. I'm also an American citizen, but I was born and raised in Canada. Canada is doing the wrong thing in most countries, or we're keeping our head out of the news to try and not have some of this stuff stick to us. But it's just the same old rich, powerful northern countries' interests on steroids. And it's fundamentally, including these military alliances with this cabal of undemocratic, military-backed right-wing governments. It's about resources. It's about access to markets. It's about access to rich land to produce things for export. And it's about oil and gas, fundamentally. And actually, I think this President Trump, Trump administration round 2.0, has actually been a bit more explicit about that and more honest about it than previous administrations when where the United States invaded, killed a lot of people, and then kidnapped the elected leader of Venezuela. The media was, well, this is getting rid of an autocrat, it's getting rid of a dictator. And Trump was like, no, it's about oil.
Exactly.
He just kept saying it. The Canadian government said, well, we will leave it to the US to decide if they're violating international law or not, but that was a pretty bad regime over there. No, it's about oil. So there's an interesting quote that we've used a lot recently from Arundhati Roy, where in reference to Palestine, but it could be in reference to everything we're talking about, the charade of Western liberal democracy lies under the rubble with tens of thousands of Palestinians. And I think what the government of the US is doing now with its allies, Canada and Western European allies, who either openly support or we keep our heads down and try and get out of the media spotlight, it's the charade of Western liberal democracy on steroids.
No, and they're just brutalizing civilians, civilian infrastructure,
Yep.
murdering journalists. Just today was another. It's just ongoing.
Yep.
You bring up the charade of drug trafficking, and particularly in Central America, we'd have to mention Juan Orlando Hernandez, who ruled over Honduras with an iron fist for 8 years, 2 terms. He wasn't allowed to get the second term, but they changed that. And that's what they deposed Mel Zelaya back in 2009. So
Yep.
he subverted the Honduran military and police and put them to service to some of the most powerful criminal organizations on the planet.
Yep.
So what do you think of Juan Orlando's comeback in a world supposedly at war with drug cartels and criminal gangs named as terrorist organizations?
Well, just puts your finger right on the heart and center of the lie. It really is a lie that there's a fundamental concern in the US about drug cartels. I think this has always been true in a very significant way, and I don't question a whole lot of serious people in the US and Canada who are concerned about illegal drugs and all the harms that come from it. There's some very
Yeah,
serious people who take this seriously. There's been a lot of harms from drugs. The whole drug issue begins and ends in the US mainly, but also Canada, because we are the major market of particularly cocaine, but now fentanyl and opium. And what we've tried to do is externalize all of the blame. The problem is over there with those people who produce it and export it to us. We're not dealing with the fact that we are the number one market in the world. And other people have talked and written a lot more about this than me. But having said that, I come back to the earlier comment in your question. The Shield of the Americas, as if it's some real serious effort to block drug trafficking, all you have to do is look at the case of Honduras. And I'll add in a Canadian angle. The coup in 2009 that deposed the elected government of Honduras was supported by the US primarily and very explicitly by Canada as well.
right.
And what happened, what followed was 12 years and 7 months, so almost 13 years, basically, and this sounds like too many adjectives, but it tells it all. This was a undemocratic, military-backed, drug trafficking, open for global business government that Canada and the US called endlessly in international forums democratic allies. 13 years of these lies and deceits.
Yeah.
All of the elections in Honduras were corrupted um, and undemocratic. The first election to bring in the known drug trafficker Pepe Lobo, and then the next two elections to bring in and keep in power Juan Orlando Hernandez, and I'll come back to him. And then finally, they had legitimate elections, and they had a decent government for 4 years.
Yeah.
Unbelievably, due to the courage and strength of the Honduran people who and their allies who had got finally able to get rid of this Canadian and US backed drug trafficking regime in power. And President Juan Orlando Hernandez was the head he was into drug trafficking before he came into politics, and then he continued to run a drug trafficking cartel from the president's office. This was
Yeah.
known the entire time as Canada and the US called it a democratic ally. And why? Well, we'll come back to it later on in the program. It has to do with keeping the country open for business. A political ally of the North, but then business, 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 mining, tourism, African palm, etc. Investments from Canada and the US grew in all of these sectors during the 13 years of this drug trafficking regime in power. And just to put a fine point on the elections last December, I think it's better to call when we say that the US weighed in on the elections and sort of swayed them, that was almost electoral regime change, what the US
Right.
did.
Absolutely.
That candidate was nowhere near a position. He was the distant third candidate, and the incumbent party Libre was in sort of a neck and neck race with this middle of the roadish Liberal Party.
Right.
The U.S. went after both of them, brought his guy to the top. He threatened to impoverish Honduras even more if Asturias wouldn't win the elections. There was corruption on election day, which ultimately didn't matter. And Asturias, Asfura wins the so-called elections, which was an electoral regime coup regime change, in my opinion. And then part of this threat to the country or message to the powerful sectors is he released Juan Orlando Hernandez. This is spectacular. Like it's horrific, but it's spectacular. 1 month later, the invasion of Venezuela takes place in the name of going after a drug trafficking president. The media just spews this stuff almost like an office of propaganda, both in Canada and the US. There were some exceptions to this, but not much. And then, meanwhile, a month before, when the US government pardoned Orlando Hernandez, who ran a drug cartel from the president's office, supported by Canada and the US, it barely made a ripple in the news. Well, that's a bit of an exaggeration. It did get some coverage. So I think the release of Juan Orlando Hernandez is not just horrific for the people of Honduras, it's also a boost to drug traffickers across the Americas. As long as you
Absolutely.
keep on the good side of the Colossus in the north and do some of their dirty business, they'll probably give you a free pass to continue doing business as usual. So
Yeah.
it's free. So Honduras is being thrown off a cliff right now as a country, and the well-being of the majority population is going off a cliff all over again because of what the US has just done, and the West, including Canada, has watched this with silent complicity.
It's truly throwing people off a cliff, figuratively speaking, but it's almost actual. In my personal experience, I've lived in Honduras
Yeah,
and been back and forth for many times, particularly out in La Mosquitia. Prior to 2009, there was drug trafficking out on the seas and there were boats passing. That's always been happening, but it never came into the villages, into the towns, and
yeah.
never put in service the people who throwing dollars at the young people who don't have any real options. Fishing is the fisheries have been exhausted by international fishing, and the lobster industry has been crashing. And there's a lot of challenges that people out in La Mosquitia face. But following 2009, suddenly these drug traffickers made home in the villages. And my last trip there was extremely harrowing because it was pretty clear the presence was everywhere. I was in Puerto Lempira, and they definitely had made home there. And I'm not sure if the last 4 years prior, had made any push against getting them out. The organized crime, once they get there, it's pretty tough to root them out. But now, open for business, as that term has been used by them as well as you,
Yeah.
is happening. So
Two quick comments because this notion of throwing the well-being of the majority population off the cliff again, this is what happened in 2009, as you're referring to. The drug trafficking through Central America didn't begin in 2009. It
no,
just took off on steroids,
yeah,
bringing this regime in power and keeping in power and lying about it. And we'll get into this probably discussing some of the open for business, including tourism, how the problem of tourism on the North Shore and Roatan and all that didn't begin in 2009. It predates it quite
yeah,
extensively, but it exploded on steroids post 2009 with this US, Canadian, global business friendly regime that also happened to be trafficking drugs. But let us not forget that the forced migrancy crisis that became all the news in the US by the mid 2010s, so a few years after 2009, Honduras was the more people fled Honduras per capita than any other country in Latin America, leaving aside Mexico, which has a complicated history because of the shared border. But more than Guatemala, more than El Salvador, more than South America, more than anywhere per capita by far, the most significant number of people being forced to flee home and country were from Honduras during this period from 2009 to 2022. And this is the byproduct. This is the direct byproduct. And that forced migrancy will begin again now as the US and the West have brought back in this horrific government, and the fears of everyone are the same. And another, just a quick comment. The government that was just a left power, the Libre Party, as I said, was a very decent government. They couldn't stop drug trafficking in 4 years. They were barely making inroads into getting rid of, little by little, 4 years is not a lot of time, making inroads into starting to weed out corruption in the judicial system, corruption in the military, corruption in the police, which we'll probably go on to talk about. And they were doing it slowly and carefully. And were they a perfect government? No. They were just beginning to make inroads to take back their government and state and the institutions of institutionality of a country. And now it's all been thrown off a cliff again.
Yeah, and what I was going to say, as a rejoinder to what you were saying, the reason people were leaving is because of this impunity, the murder rate, the organized crime in the cities, like the cities Tegucigalpa, San Pedro Sula. It's almost unlivable, whereas they were never perfect. There's always been stuff going on. But as you said, they became totally dangerous if you had even a decent car, the worry about getting carjacked. All these murders, nobody being convicted, nothing, So rooting out that corruption is really a big part of making people want to stay in the country.
Yeah.
So we got to take a break for our radio listeners. So we'll be back to talk more about what's happening in Honduras and Central America. You're listening to Eco Justice Radio, a listener-supported media outlet. Please consider making a donation to ensure that we can continue to provide socially and environmentally driven content. Donations can be made at ecojusticeradio.org and socal350.org. For an extended version of this interview, as well as other benefits, we encourage you to become a member of our Patreon at patreon.com/ecojusticeradio. Today, you're listening to Honduras in Resistance, a case study in U.S. imperialism and corruption. I'm your host, Jack Eidt, and we feature a conversation with Grahame Russell, co-founder and director of Rights Action, doing land, environment, and human rights defense work in Central America. This is a clip from the documentary Play Junkanoo Play, the masked Christmas processional, as we played earlier from Waranagua, which is also called Junkanoo, blends African European, Native American, Arawak, Carib, art traditions in which social and cultural identities are expressed through music, dance, and costume. The documentary comes from Documentary Educational Resources.
The militaristic component of the Wanargo as we know it today, I think has a lot to do with the experience of the Garifuna people. Drummers position themselves near the front door or the veranda of each house, with the lead drummer in the middle. The song leader and chorus always stand behind or to the side of the drummers. Dancers position themselves opposite the drummers and embellish traditional dances with individual stylized movements. Dancers enter the ring one after the other, each challenging the primero drummer to rhythmically interpret his movements.
Wanarga is the most difficult rhythm to perform because usually in other rhythms, the drummer plays and the dancer dances to that rhythm. With the Wanarga, the drummer plays for the dancer. So it becomes a challenging thing between the drummer to always be on top of his game to catch whatever the dancer throws at him.
Okay, I'm back with Grahame Russell from Rights Action talking Honduras. So, Rights Action does a lot of work with the Garifuna people. Can you tell about their Caribbean coastal way of life and the actually amazing coexistence in villages stretching all the way between Belize and Nicaragua? It's really just an amazing way of life of these people that I discovered a long time ago and really fell in love with. So if you could tell us a little bit about the background.
Well, I'll do my best. We in Rights Action, and I just as hard and complicated and let's not kid ourselves, sad and depressing as a lot of this work is on an ongoing basis. We're a group that chips away at it from Canada and the US. And once you do this work, things become an honor and a privilege. And it's been a privilege and an honor to work with a group like OFRENE, the main sort of the fraternal organization of Black Honduras, as they were called. This is the most sort of, it is the leading sort of grassroots Garifuna organization in Honduras. They were established in the late 70s, and I know their backstory a fair bit. We started supporting them and working with them directly in 1998. And like we do in all our work, we do a combination of direct grassroots funding to the land, rights, culture, and justice defenders that we work with. And we do north-south advocacy work, trying to tell, because most struggles we support have to do one way or another with the role of Canada and the US and our private sectors in these countries. It could be mining, it could be tourism, it could be ag industry, it could be hydroelectric dams. Most of the communities we support, like the Garifuna, are being harmed and affected, obviously by their own elites, but their own elites work in conjunction with global investors, banks, and companies in these different sectors of the economy. And so our work is always a combination of direct funding and human rights accompaniment, along with doing north-south education and advocacy work. So we started working with the Garifan and the OFRENE organization in 1998, and we're still able to keep on supporting and working with them today. And I learned very briefly about I'm not an expert on their long history of the Garifuna people, but they go back to the escaped African slaves. This goes back to the slave trade, the white Christian European imperialist takeover of the Americas, including the islands that we know as the Caribbean islands. And quite literally, the foundation of the Garifuna people, which is sort of, I hate using the word hybrid, but they're almost like a hybrid people of escaped African slaves and some of the original peoples of the Caribbean, specifically the Carib people and the Arawak people. You could probably get an expert and fine tune this a lot better than I can. But on the islands that are now known as San Vincent and the Grenadines, that were called something else historically by the locals, escaped African slaves or people, shipwrecked African slaves, wound up there. And on those islands, there was some holdouts of indigenous people resisting the onslaught of the French, the British, the Portuguese, and the Spanish back in the 15, 16, and 1700s. And while they fought themselves between themselves originally, then they just became, over the course of generations and even centuries, I believe, they became a people. And so the Garifuna people today are this sort of extraordinary mixture of indigenous people who resisted colonialism, imperialism, and in the enslavement of the Caribbean islands, intermingling over generations with escaped African slaves. The long and the short of it is that sometime in the late 1700s, 1798 is the date often given, the British, who were now the biggest imperialist, they were the United States of the day. The British were the
Yeah.
biggest Western imperialist power, and the United States was still an infant. The United States, for me, is just like the child of imperialism that grew up and took over the company, took over the
Exactly.
cartel, and Canada's the little brother of imperialism that grew up to remain the little brother. That's a bit of an aside. The British gave the people on St. Vincent and Grenadines an ultimatum. We want the island. You're dead, or you can skedaddle. And at the time, Honduras wasn't the country of Honduras. It was still in the throes of the imperialism struggles. It wasn't incorporated as a country till 1815 or so, I believe. They landed on Roatan, the
Yeah.
infamous Roatan Island. They landed there first. Depending on the accounts, you're going to get a few thousand or even in the high hundreds of Garifuna people, this mixture of indigenous and escaped African slaves. And somehow the word started to become used in English as Garifuna. They spread from the Roatan and the other so-called Bay Islands just north of the Honduras shore onto the mainland, and over generations spread south into, as you know, through Mosquitia and down into what's known as Nicaragua now, and even into Costa Rica and up into Guatemala and Belize. And people often refer to them in history, certainly the British did, as the Black Caribs and stuff like this. But all along, the Garifuna people kept this unique language, which I can barely sort of dissect the
Yeah, yeah.
linguistic roots of, but it's a mixture of African languages and then indigenous languages from the Caribbean area. They just formed as a people, and they were always a coastal people. Fisher people lived off the land, lived off the ocean, lived off coconuts. And then some local agriculture. They were never sort of clear-cutting forests to produce for export. But they also grew, and this is spectacular in my view, as a matriarchal society and a profoundly sort of communal ownership of land, which they fight for
Yes.
today. They remain, and this is all in play, this is all in battle over the last 40, 50, 60 years, primarily because of the onslaught of tourism. But also there's African palm onslaught, and then there is the cartels. Drug trafficking goes through there. Drug trafficking often overlaps with the tourism industry. It overlaps with the African palm producers funded by the World Bank and others. And meanwhile, they survive and they resist. And they have a culture of resistance going back to when they were forced, when they survived, they became a people on the Caribbean islands. They resisted 2 centuries plus now in this country called Honduras, and they were always ignored and treated racistly as the blacks and or those indigenous black people. And now they resist the onslaught of the global economy that simply wants them off the lands to use the land for tourism. And then you throw, so the two key, besides resistance, the two key things, and then I'll throw it back to you, is they remain matriarchal society and they remain profoundly tied to communal ownership of the land, which obviously the tourisms want to rip apart and they want to individualize and sell plots of land. So their understanding of the commons, call it the commons, is profound and alive and well today in a world that's sort of on steroids with capitalism and the privatization of everything.
Yeah, I mean, I had that underlined pretty heavily, and we're going to talk a little bit about Cayos Cochinos, but you access it from a little community called Nueva Armenia. And this is a lovely little village, but what happened is the African palm oil took over pretty much all of those land because these people survived. Their little villages were on the coast, and they would be fishing off and growing things in up the little rivers. Instead, it's all African palm, just
Yeah.
completely invading the village in a way that was kind of shocking. I've also lived in villages that were far away. I lived in Limon before the road reached out there a little further down the coast. And I got to experience firsthand what you're talking about and the protection of the communal way of living in that
Communal way of living.
really just was extremely enlightening for me. So you there was a recent criterio was put out a summary of since 2015 to 2026 different things have been going on. There's one the concept of territory occupied by third parties in Punta Piedra in Colón. The Inter-American Court of Human Rights condemned Honduras for violating the collective property rights
Yeah.
the Garifuna community, and they failed to guarantee proper legal titling of the territory. That's a big deal, and of course the conflicts, threats, and death of community members. Can you tell us a little?
This stuff is, you're right to mention African palm because it's in violation of all the above as well, which we'll talk about. But tourism remains the key driver of all of this forced dispossession through corruption and violence. Anywhere that's from the beach to 2 or 3 kilometers inland. Tourism doesn't really want much more than that in the
Right.
short term. We can get to Roatan and these model cities, as they're being called, which is a dispossession on a whole other extreme level. But the tourisms, they want the first 2, 3, or 4 kilometers of the beachfront and push the Garifuna off or of these lands. And original title of the Garifuna goes back to national law in Honduras. So some of it goes back to the 1800s. Some of it goes all through the 1900s. They kept on fighting for titling of their land. And I'm not the legal expert you would want on the show to trace the whole history of it, but it starts with national law. And then as the tourism, and so they're clearly the original owners of this land based on national law and concepts of indigenous rights and communal ownership over land. And this started to be violated left, right, and center going back to the 90s and to 80s and 90s when the tourism boom push really began, even before the narco regime from 2009 to 2022. All that did was accelerate all this on steroids. So they've been fighting and losing and fighting and losing for decades already. They started going to the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights and then the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. And this is some of the stuff when we joined supporting their struggles. We started helping fund them all the time as they were trying to fight this particular case and that particular case and take their cases to the Commission and then the American Court of Human Rights. And they've kept on winning. They've won 4 or 5 decisions from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights that are all fundamentally based on their prior collective ownership of the land. And it's enough to, which all just reiterates what national law has always said along that whole North Shore, that they are the original owners of these lands. They are their lands. So fundamentally, pretty much all of the so-called tourism development over the last 30, 40, 50 years is illegal and whip-de-doo. But it's illegal. And if there was any political environment and a decent government and a real rule of law, they would have land claims issues for every plot of land, east to west, 3 to 4 kilometers inland, and around the bend and up into Guatemala, probably. It's just there's no room for it. There's some impunity and corruption are endemic, and they're about to get worse, as we were discussing with the regime that was just put back into power. But they've always had the moral high ground. They've always been right. This is their land. It's been proved in national law. It's been proved in international law, and it keeps on being taken away by hook and crook and violence every step of the way. And tourism all along the coast and on the islands, Roatan and the Bay Islands, is the #1 driver of that.
Yeah, so a couple other places that were underlined, Triunfo de la Cruz and San Juan, both near Tela, which is, been developing these mega resorts,
Yeah.
Recently. But I wanted to talk a little bit more about Cayos Cochinos, which I mentioned earlier, because this is a basically a little fishing community that exists just off the coast. Now we talked about the Bay Islands, and we can talk more about the model cities and things going on the bigger Bay Islands. This is a little key just south or southeast a little bit of Roatan. Incredibly beautiful spot. It takes, a few hours on a little boat to access it. And this has been a fishing place, excuse me, for years and years, but they're not allowed to fish, or at least they're limited to their fishing for conservation purposes, Which, could you tell us a little bit about what's going on with this up there?
Listen, you may even know more about that particular chaos than I do, because over the years we've sort of supported
So many
orphanage
different
and
things.
struggles
Yeah.
in so many different communities.
Yeah.
But about the fishing and the so-called conservation, that's a widespread problem, and not just in Honduras, with indigenous
Exactly.
peoples everywhere, that at a certain point, the depletion of our oceans doesn't come from the indigenous people doing what's often referred to as subsistence level fishing, whatever it is they might be fishing. It comes from the industrialization of the planet, the consumer societies in the global north, in parts of Asia, etc. Like we have consumption on steroids on this planet in far-flung markets. And that's the depletion of the oceans, let alone the pollution and contamination of the oceans, not local fisher people. But once you get a law in place, the intent of the law is really by saying you can't do your local fishing anymore because we're protecting the environment. That's just deceit, 100% deceit. It's just another way to forcibly displace the local populations who are subsistence farmers, subsistence fisher people who have long taken care of the ocean, long taken care of the land, the trees, the forest, and the water sources.
Yeah.
They are being ousted through conservation laws, environmental laws, land possession laws. They're not the owners of a law because there's a piece of paper from a corrupt judge that says they don't have title. And if none of that works, then it's violence. One way or another, dispossession is what's behind this sort of so-called pretense of protecting the the overfished oceans. And
Well, the Bay Islands is the perfect location for survivor show. Like I think there was like
the
a
Spanish one,
European version. What's that?
yeah, it's the Spanish one. It's
The Spanish one,
unbelievable.
right?
El País has written articles, and then we've
Yes.
translated and shared them. And I mean, this should be a Hollywood movie. It's so absurd, it's so pathetic, but it's so grotesquely real. And so for those who have resources in the world, the rich and wealthier Hondurans and Latin Americans, or tourism, the world of tourism from North America, Canada, the US, and Europe, who doesn't want to go to a lovely beach resort somewhere and have your dream vacation? Advertisement in Canada, in the US, companies advertise on billboards, let alone in magazines. Buy a piece of Caribbean paradise, buy a slice of the Caribbean. Who doesn't want that, especially in northern countries where we have more disposable wealth and we have cold winters? And so this is already bad enough, and it's a driver of everything that you and I are talking about, let alone you get the more grotesque manifestation of that, which is like the survival show. And so they were filming the survival show, and then Garifuna people and local other African descendant people sort of start pushing in, politely, kindly, but pushing in while they're filming their show. And no one knows what the heck's going on. And they're just kind of reminding them politely, you're on stolen lands.
It's an amazing area, and there's all these islands, small little key islands that are owned privately by billionaires or millionaires or whatever
Yeah.
they are. Sometimes they're just, the caretakers living there. There's not even a human hanging out there. Occasionally it's rented out by, whatever type of tourism. So it's these clashes. One of the great things when I first experienced Honduras is how parts of Honduras were really not deeply touched by all of the colonialism that's been around forever, and that's part of La Mosquitia and part of the lands of the Garifuna at that time in the 90s when I first was traveling around. But it's amazing how when you get rid of a government and, make them open for business, and even though it's not safe for tourists to walk around, we'll cover this a little bit more. We're going to take another break. And I also want to get to talk a little bit about your work in Guatemala as well. So we'll be back with Grahame Russell in a minute. You are listening to Eco Justice Radio, a listener-supported media outlet. Please consider making a donation to ensure that we can continue to provide socially and environmentally driven content. Donations can be made at ecojusticeradio.org and socal350.org. For an extended version of this interview, as well as other benefits, we encourage you to become a member of our Patreon at patreon.com/ecojusticeradio. Today you're listening to Honduras in Resistance, a case study in U.S. imperialism and corruption. I'm your host, Jack Eidt, and we feature a conversation with Grahame Russell, co-founder and director of Rights Action, doing land, environment, and human rights defense work in Central America. This is a recording from Ofrene, the Honduran Black fraternal organization. It's called Hunchelu. It's a Garifuna call and response in the community of Sambo Creek, recorded in June 2013. We're back with Grahame Russell. I want to talk about Trujillo, which is a little further down the coast, heading east on the Caribbean coast of Honduras. It's where O. Henry coined the term Banana Republic and was always sort of a battleground between, the colonial entities and the wild people, indigenous people, and what was happening in the less populated La Mosquitia. And it's where William Walker took his last attempt to take over all of Central America, or whatever it was. Right as the 2009 coup went down, Pepe Lobo went over to this Canadian who has been dubbed a porn king. He was not a factor prior to 2009, or at least not a significant factor. And then he made a deal to take over a Garifuna community and build a cruise ship terminal. And now luxury vacation developments have compounded. And, the story gets uglier from there. So, Graham, you want to let us know what's going on?
The quote unquote porn king's name is Randy Jorgensen, and he's a Canadian fellow from either Saskatchewan or Manitoba. And we started finding out about this in the early mid 2000s because Ofrene, involved in all these struggles, would say, as we know, it's tourism's the problem. And after a while, they would start saying, "Hey, have you ever heard about this Randy Jorgensen?" We started calling him the porn king, and I'll tell you why. They just knew that there was he was a big fish in a little pond. And this is going into 98, 99, all the 2000s before the coup. Because the coup, as you said, he took off into the stratosphere. But all through the late 90s and in 2000s, Randy Jorgensen was known as sort of a big fish in a little pond, pushing ahead with tourism in the Trujillo area mainly and spreading out east and west from there. It was very problematic for Ofrene because they were just sort of getting plots of land piece by piece and then selling it off, developing it themselves for timeshare condos, small and medium-sized hotels, bars and restaurants, etc. Or they'd flip it to developers who would start doing gated communities. And there's a long history of that. And in that area, Randy Jorgensen's been directly and indirectly involved with a lot of it, all through the 2000s, leading up to the coup in 2009. So once we started finding out about him and got into the backstory, it was discovered that there used to be a well-known magazine in Canada called Maclean's, which is not unlike Time or Newsweek. It was Canada's version of Time or Newsweek. I think it's defunct now, or maybe it's only online. They pursued Randy Jorgensen in the 90s because he was sort of a local, smaller version of
Larry Flint.
Larry Flint, the hustler guy. So he was a Canadian version of Larry Flint. And so he was into the online pornography business. We found this out after the fact. And back in 93 or 94, and I can send you the article, we've published it before and republished it. He was on the front page of Maclean's as the porn king, the king of porn. I can't remember if it was the king of porn or the porn king. Randy Jorgensen, the king of porn, skirts Canadian criminal law. And he used a lot of the same arguments that Larry Flint used about freedom of expression and this, that, and the other thing. And some of his stuff went to the Supreme Court of Canada. And I didn't follow the law of it too closely in Canada because this was all after the fact. Whatever path Randy Jorgensen took, he and his dad found their own way to Honduras, unbeknownst to us, unbeknownst to Ofrene. So somehow they'd already found their little paradise down there, and this was a good way to get out of the limelight in Canada from being known as these pornography distributors. And so then when we start pursuing him and finding out more about him, we find out about the article and we start labeling him the king of porn, Randy Porn King Jorgensen, and some of our urgent actions because he's being denounced for, corruption of a local official or stealing land or threatening local and Garifuna communities and getting hold of their land. And he's living there with his father. And then they are wrapped up in Honduras in 2001 in a criminal operation with underage girls. And they both got tied up in the law in Honduras on this, and then it got shelved. And we never were able to, and the charges were dropped or stayed. So where there's smoke, there's fire. I don't know really what was going on then, but he and his father seem to have brought some of their same interests to Honduras. But that's where he got the name. And Ofrene is sort of battling with him and people like him all through the 2000s, and we're supporting this. And it's very violent, it's corrupt, and it's land eviction and land theft. Then comes the coup, as you say, in 2009. And Honduras puts up these billboards all across the country. Honduras is open for business. And the first corrupt president was Pepe Lobo. And all of a sudden, there's these photos flying around the internet that there is Randy Jorgensen getting into a private plane with Ramon Lobo, the brother of Pepe Lobo. He's in tight with this new Western imposed open for business president. And his business empire just starts to grow on steroids. And he's still there. He's there's a lot more critical attention on them. There's a lot more spotlights on them. He's run into trouble with the law, especially with the previous government of President Xiomara Castro, the one that was just ousted. I suspect that any pending legal issues against him are about to be shelved or
No. Yeah.
just trashed. And the tourism battles, because of what the US and did with this electoral regime change, all of these issues that you and I are discussing are undoubtedly going to get worse for the Garifuna people. And the medium-sized players like Randy Jorgensen, they're going to push ahead. Small-time North American people who want to buy a piece of the Caribbean, probably markets will open up for them. And they don't know that they're actually buying into stolen land in probably most, if not all cases. And then the big time operators, I suspect that their fortunes will increase as well. And this will all bode not well at all for the Garifuna people.
Yeah, so it's like a mini Epstein operation happening down there, whether they're collaborating with the big shots of the Epstein class and the Epstein empire. I'm not sure, but they really have the same business model.
Well, there's a darker story to that, and I'll shift over to it. And I don't know to what degree, if at all, Randy Jorgensen, the porn king we've been talking about, he's further along in Trujillo, further east. But on the islands, the Roatan Islands, the big island of Roatan, and some of the Bay Islands, a story blew open in 2022 of basically an organized crime ring, mainly American citizens. Their names are well known now. Three of them have been captured, and they called themselves the Delta Force. So this stuff goes from complicated and not good, like we were discussing with Randy, to and people who take advantage of expanding tourism businesses in those conditions we just discussed, to dark. This stuff gets very dark. And you almost have these, if all that's being reported on and if all that went into Honduran courts is true, and we're about to publish a translation of an in-depth article published on Radio Progreso, and this deep dive by a well-known investigative reporter, a deep dive into this case related to one woman in particular, Angie Pena. So I'll try and make this brief. On New Year's Day 2022, so January 1st, 2022, she was up celebrating New Year's on Roatan Island. She was up with her sister, maybe some friends. They were just partying, having a good time. She was stolen by this, apparently. None of this has been proved in court. So we'll throw out the allegations
Yeah.
word a lot. But it's this stuff's true, as far as I'm concerned. She was stolen by an organized crime ring known locally as the Delta Team, and it's comprised mainly of Americans. And they deal in sex traffic, they deal in child pornography, they deal in drugs and weapons. Legit, like small time, medium size, whatever you want to call it. This is an organized crime ring. It was known on the island of Roatan. They have known hotels, famous hotels there, well-known ones like the Dock. Two of the people who are wrapped up, implicated deeply in this are the main guy's a guy named Gary Lee Johnson. He's in jail now in Honduras waiting a final trial. I suspect there's going to be some corruption in the legal process. He and another fellow named, I think it's Anthony Frank Grayson, are co-owners of a hotel called The Dock. They founded this Delta team around 2017. Like they were probably in, they were already sort of pedophiles dealing with the sex market already, and then they formed sort of a mini cartel as it's being presented in the media.
The Delta
The,
Force.
the Delta Force, the Delta team, and their sort of star rose during this drug trafficking regime of Juan Orlando Hernandez that was supported by Canada and the US, called it a democratic ally. Just the way Randy Jorgensen over by Trujillo, his star rise in tourism took off on steroids during the same time period. And there's corruption of local judges, there's corruption of police, there's corruption of prosecutors. And this was stuff that was apparently known. We'd heard little bits about it all the years, but there hadn't been a deep dive. And now there's a deep dive because of the disappearance of Angie Pena. And that case goes on. Her family won't let it go. And apparently she's alive. Apparently she's alive and been traded and resold and sold into a sex trafficking ring. In her case, the allegations are that she was sold by this Delta team to a consumer named William James Murdoch, known locally as Senor Smith, and he's also on trial for this. And
Wow.
where that case goes, they're back into court apparently. So stay tuned on the details of the trial. But the bigger issue is this is what's happening on the North Shore of Honduras. This is what's happening to the original lands of the Garifuna people. And then Roatan is taking some of this stuff on steroids, in part because of these crime rings that operate there with impunity. And
So Prospera, which is the model city that some
yeah,
call it a charter city.
mhm,
It's an employment and development zone. In Spanish, it's a ZEDES.
yeah.
There's a private libertarian dream cities, free trade zones. Talk about steroids of open for business.
Well, this one's, I don't know if they have anything to do at all with, it's the same area, it's the same Roatan Island. And this Prospera has carved out a vast chunk of land, and I think it's fundamentally, ultimately, all ill-gotten lands. It's all stolen lands, one way or another, going back in history. But they've got a vast chunk of land, and they're setting up this model city that we can discuss a bit. I don't know if they have anything to do or not with the existence of the Delta team and this
Right.
network, this drug
Right.
trafficking,
They,
arms
they got
trafficking.
enough guilty things for other
But
issues.
the Prospero one, this is where some of the reporting that makes sense to me. This is why the government of President Trump just so casually did the electoral regime change, because the driving force behind Prospero is Peter Thiel,
Right.
who is this extremely wealthy billionaire. He's been written about online. I'm not the expert on Peter Thiel's background and his networks,
Well,
but he
there's
is one of the
Palantir, which is basically spying ring that they've been pushing forward, and their dream of their libertarian
yes,
city where they just take Honduran land and put a big fence around it, and the Honduran, elites maybe are benefiting a little bit, and they force people to work there, but
yeah,
it has no oversight from the Honduran government and becomes
no.
its own entity.
And so then one often asks, what's the purpose of regime change? Well, the Prospera and this dream world of Peter Thiel, the billionaires and his ilk, privatized cities that unto themselves, is another product of the coup in 2009,
Yeah.
because this whole thing grew out of Honduras is open for business from 2009 to 2022. And it was always contested from day one, and got Ofrenes involved in the resistance to this. And we helped fund grassroots struggle to sort of report on this and bring attention to this. And we're not taking the lead on anything here. This is sort of the little role we play in a lot of this stuff. When the new government came in, finally in 2022, they're pulling the deal. They found illegalities in the entire legal artifice set up to create this ZA, this development zone, as they call it, Peter Thiel's dream home community of Prospera. The new government was pulling the whole deal because it was illegally constituted and it violated the constitutional law in Honduras. And then Peter Prospera started using these international tribunals, which are set up basically to defend corporate investor rights. And they've got a multi-billion-dollar lawsuit against the previous government of Honduras. This is why, in my view, the U.S. government did the electoral coup in December of last year, late last year, to get rid of a decent government that was going to fight for the well-being and rights of the Honduran people, protect the Constitution, put back in power a government that is now all of a sudden going to probably sit down at the negotiation table with Prospera in the International Tribunal and say, listen, if you pull your lawsuit, this so-called lawsuit against us, basically it's extortion, then yeah, we can free up the papers again and normalize and the Prospera project so you can go ahead. That is almost guaranteed to happen with this new US-backed government in power.
Well, it's this has
It's
been
hard stuff.
this has been a tough little trip down to Honduras here. You know,
The one thing I appreciate very much is you taking the time to cover Honduras. There are nightmare stories going across the planet.
yeah,
And little old countries in Central America often get dealt with for a minute or two here or there, but they're sort of forgotten, except for in the worst years of the genocides, the US-backed genocides and slaughter in the 70s and 80s. They're sort of forgotten and they're sort of written off in many ways and it's not like there aren't some very serious issues going on in Israel, Lebanon, Palestine,
yeah, we
to
know.
all the rest. You've named them all. But it's very important to tell a
Yes.
story like this of Honduras because it's almost like an archetypal story of really what's going on.
Well, and as the Donroe Doctrine has reminded us, it's in our backyard, so to speak, meaning that Honduras it's a quick cruise straight down from New Orleans to take over and stop them from doing anything good. Anything that doesn't fit with the
Yep.
US plan. And this Prospera is like it's a crazy version of, I just are there more that because they were talking about a free charter city around Trujillo. They were talking about one in the south on the Pacific coast. I think is Amapola Island or something like
Yeah.
that. Are these things? Are we going to see these again? Pop their ugly heads up again?
Other people will know more about this than me. Prosper is the one that took off and advanced the most. I think in the short term, Prospera has to be resolved. And
Right.
as I already I suspect it'll be resolved somehow. Not surprisingly, in favor of Prospera, Peter Thiel and his co-investors, and the new government will somehow put an end to any legal proceedings the previous government had against the illegality of the establishment of Prospera. Once that gets normalized, and I suspect it will, I fear it will, but it wouldn't surprise me, then of course I think this model is going to only increase as long as we live in a global order where certain powerful governments are promoting the rights of billionaires any and everywhere.
Yeah.
And it's sort of a working model now, and the US is taking the lead in this sort of model around the world. So, but Prospera is an important case that they need to resolve. They need to resolve in their favor, which I hope they don't, but I suspect they will.
Yeah.
And then
Well,
more will follow.
Well, Graham Russell, I wanted to get into work that you're doing in Guatemala. We'll have to bring you back for another show because that's probably an hour of discussion of things that are going on there. But there's some good work that you've been doing out there. Can you let our listeners know how they can follow your work, contribute to your work, and you really keep people apprised. So anyone with any interest in what's happening in Central America. You're really good with the emails.
Well, what we try and do all the time, whether we're talking about struggles we support in Honduras or Guatemala, so we always try and connect the dots between what's going on in Honduras and Guatemala and Central America is really connected to what's going on in so many different places of the world.
Yeah.
And as opposed to being an isolated, different, special thing, it's just one more region that is being sort of devastated by global political, military, and economic forces. And we stay with it. We don't drop what we're doing there to turn our attention to the Middle East, Cuba, or Venezuela. We try and connect the dots and so that
Right.
we understand how interconnected all this stuff is. I recommend people subscribe to our listserv, which they can do through our website, rightsaction.org, or review the website, get familiar with our work. And if you like what you see, then yeah, subscribe to our listserv primarily is my first recommendation. You can follow us to a lesser degree on Twitter, so X, so Facebook and Instagram. But the listserv is the best source of regular information all the time. And then people can reach out and send their questions or comments to us at info@rightsaction.org for more information and take it from there.
Great. Well, thank you for coming on Eco Justice Radio and sharing with us. It's important to bring to light what all these really unfortunate entities are doing to truly, I think the Honduran people have gifted me so much in my life. And it's amazing how much they face these difficulties. It's an extremely impoverished place. People live with very little, but then we have these entities coming and taking what little they have left. I think it's beautiful, the work that you're doing, and I thank you for it.
Well, I appreciate the time and space, Jack, and I look forward to keeping in touch.
Great. Hey, listeners, to check out the extended recording of this show or to explore our other shows, visit our website, ecojusticeradio.org, and subscribe to our podcast. This has been Eco Justice Radio and our show, Honduras in Resistance, a case study in U.S. imperialism and corruption. Thank you to Grahame Russell, and thank you to our listeners for joining us. Please connect with us on social media at Eco Justice Radio, SoCal 350, and Wilder Utopia. If you like what you've heard, you want others to be informed, subscribe and share the episodes. You've been listening to Eco Justice Radio, a project of SoCal 350. Executive producer and co-host myself, Jack Eidt, co-host Carrie Kim, and engineer and original music by Blake Quake Beats. And until next time, remember, the power is yours.